one would think so. However, as I said, that's not the only consideration. If one wanted to introduce a grant system, one would not only base it on GDP levels, one would also base it on the cost of delivering these services. So we don't know the answer to that. That's the sort of thing one would have to look at if one said, say, replace the Barnett formula with a grant-based system such as the one in Australia.
But we
don't know the answer to that.
You point out, though, that Scotland is a very different place now compared to the 1970s when the Barnett formula was devised. What do you mean by that?
It's different in terms of relative GDP levels. It's different in terms of perhaps the cost of delivery of public services. The public services delivered now are not the ones that were there in the late 70s.
Do you think we would lose out in a needs-based assessment?
It's difficult to predict. And with that, we haven't got to that stage yet. Clearly, if that were to be the preferred way forward, and we're not saying that in the report, we're saying it might be a grant-based system, it might be tax assignment, it might be an element of fiscal autonomy, it might be elements of all three. Most other countries use elements of all three. But if you did go down the route of a grant-based system, then the result may well be different. It would be unlikely to be the same. It would be an accident if it was exactly the same.
And what's your instinct? What's your gut feeling? Would it go down?
You can't tell. You can't tell from the evidence at present. That's the sort of thing we would analyse in any follow-up.
Is there an agreed way of working these things out, or does it just depend on which politicians are deciding?
No, as we point out in the report, there are different ways of setting these grants. I've just given you the example of the Australian Grant Commission, which is an independent commission, which sets it in order to try and emphasise equity across all the subnational governments in Australia. That's one obvious way of doing it, but there are others.
Okay, you say there's increasing levels of discontent elsewhere in the UK with the spending levels currently enjoyed in Scotland. What's the evidence of that?
We do cite some political evidence in terms of surveys, which does suggest that more recently, especially in England, voters seem to think that Scotland gets more than its fair share. But that's just political perception, and these results are cited in here. But I think more generally, Barnett is unique. No other country does it this way. Most other countries have found a system of financing which maps in some way onto these basic characteristics which we outline here. It actually makes active choices around these issues. However, the report is not only about Barnett. What we're saying is more fundamental than that, and that's the key message of this report.
Okay.
It's not all about Barnett.
You say that if Scotland was to raise all the money it spends, full fiscal autonomy, that it would be difficult to visualise how this might be consistent with the maintenance of the Union. Why?
Because it would lead to massive differences in the delivery of public services across the UK. There are very few examples across the world where you have countries which within have subnational governments that have full fiscal autonomy. In fact, if one excludes sort of islands communities like the Island Islands or the Isle of Man, or one can only think of the Basque countries and Navarre in Spain, and even in those cases, what is ostensibly full fiscal autonomy, in fact, is subject to central government control, and there have been several clashes, as we point out in the report, between these autonomous communities and central government in Spain.
And if there was some transfer of tax powers, that might be challenged by the EU, would it?
Well, we've set out in some circumstances there would be issues raised. It's a complex issue, that of the EU. In the case of VAT, it may be a problem. But no, I mean, in case of other types of taxes, like personal income taxes or other types of taxes, many other EU countries have systems in which some of the tax rates and tax bases are devolved downwards, either to states or regions or localities. So that would not necessarily be a problem. You could devolve more tax powers.
Of all the things you've looked at, what's the worst?
We're not saying that there is a worst a worse type of financing system here, because they all have strengths and weaknesses in terms of these characteristics. We thought it was important for us to set out these key principles. The Commission then really has to set out what is the constitutional order that it wants for the UK, what are the key principles that matter most. Is it equal delivery of public service? Is it a degree of autonomy on the part of the individual countries? Once you determine those, it's then obvious which is the best or which is the worst or which might be optimal given these constraints. There isn't a best and a worst.
Do you wish they'd told you that before you set out on this exercise?
Not at all, because we always envisaged us doing a first report which was setting out landscape. That's what this does. We were fully anticipating our expert group was fully anticipating getting further requests from the Commission for assistance on any of the issues that we highlight or any of the other issues which they are likely to come up with. It's an iterative process, and we'll be around as long as the Commission want us to give them any additional evidence.
Professor Anton Muscatelli, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, now, the Kármán Commission, you'll recall, was set up by the three main pro-union parties to consider how devolution